Joining us now, our NHL insider, TSN's NHL insider, our Wednesday regular from the Dregs Hockey Podcast. And for those watching on video, you can take the boy out of Saskatchewan, but you can't take Saskatchewan out of the boy. Darren Dreger. How are you, buddy?
I'm good. This is a vintage Rider shirt, by the way. I don't even remember when it was sent to me. It's got to be, between 5 and 10 years ago. So every once in a while, I'll dust it off. And I just felt like sticking it to the Vancouver market a little.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Just seemed to be appropriate to wear it here, guys.
Everyone else is sticking it to this market this week. And something tells me if Dregs digs deep enough in the closet, there's an old 22 Lancaster somewhere kicking around. Well, needless to say, a hell of a week here in Vancouver. Let's start from the top and let's move our way into Rick Tocchet's got a win. Didn't get necessarily the warmest of receptions at Rogers Arena, but he got a win last night, Dregs. And you and Ray were talking on Ray and Dregs about some of the primary reasons why they brought Tocchet and to a lesser degree Adam Foote in. Explain, sir.
Well, and I would extend it to Gonchar, but Tocchet and Foote especially, it's excellent communication skill and an ability still today to connect with today's player. Bruce was noted as being a very player-friendly coach, and I don't think that there was a lack of communication between Bruce Boudreau and the core players of the Vancouver Canucks. But in this case, Rick Tocchet, Adam Foote, Sergei Gonchar, they really don't know the Vancouver Canucks player by player, other than what they've been paying attention to over probably the last several weeks now, right? It's not like, Rick Tocchet just rolled onto the scene and then decided, I wonder who would be a real good associate or assistant coach, and Gonchar would be nice, and I wonder if Adam Foote. Come on, these conversations have been ongoing for quite some time. So I think that they come in with an absolute clean slate. There are certain ways, and, no surprise that Tocchet and Foote especially kind of played the same game, through their NHL careers. Different positions, but played the game hard, would never get outworked, fiercely competitive, fiercely loyal, all of those things. And from a character perspective, I extend that to Gonchar as well. So they're going to make it top priority to get to know each one of the players. And probably not just at the NHL level, but also through the system, certainly in the American League. Find out what makes these guys tick. Learn what their strengths or weaknesses are. As Tocchet has already shared and talked about, how do you know a guy can't kill penalties if he's never given the opportunity to kill a penalty or hasn't been taught, how to kill a penalty? And same thing applies to the power play. You always look at your skilled guys and think, okay, well, they're obviously minded that way, so they'll be good power play ads. Well, Sergei Gonchar probably has something to say about that. So I just, those guys have nothing to lose on the short term here. So priority has to be finding out what they've got internally at the levels that we've already talked about. And they're all workhorses, so I think that those would be considered their strengths going into this.
At the managerial level, Jim Rutherford has pledged to zip it. I'm wondering what that means with regards to Patrick Allvin and his role in the organization, and just how this chapter with Bruce might affect this management team going forward, Drex.
Well, let's start with Jimmy. By zip it, I think that's wise, right? Just stay out of the public eye unless you need to be there. And on occasion, maybe he'll need to be there, but not certainly as much as he's been at the forefront since he arrived, essentially, in Vancouver. You gotta give Patrick Allvin all the tools, and dealing with media and dealing with public pushback, or flip side is some of the good things that go along with being a general manager in the National Hockey League are part of the job. That's prerequisite. Well, how do you learn and sharpen that skill set if you've got a guy who's as outgoing and has so much experience in that regard, like Jim Rutherford does under his belt, kind of taking the floor on a regular basis and occurrence? So whether that came to Jim or whether it was talked about internally by management, by ownership, I don't know. I haven't bothered to try and get to the bottom of it. But I do think it's important. Patrick Allvin needs to make some mistakes. That's how you learn as a general manager. And not just mistakes by, signing this player or trading that player. I mean, that happens every single year with the most experienced NHL GMs, but also learning how to manage media, especially locally, and then how that translates nationally, because you guys know this. Nothing rankles a local media base more than all of the information coming out nationally before it is managed locally. And look, in Canada, I don't look at it as me having a national presence. That's the reality of the situation. I look at it as having 7 teams that I've got to stay in tune with, the 7 Canadian teams. And I have nothing but respect for the local markets because all those reporters do such great, great work. But in this case, it was easy for Allvin maybe to just deflect to Jimmy because of the relationships that Rutherford has had for many years with so many reporters across the globe.
Here's what I'll say,
Allvin needs to develop that skill. Like, he needs to speak in the public. But there's a difference between surrendering the spotlight and surrendering the power. Do you think Rutherford's actually going to take a step back from decision-making and hand that to Allvin, or just the speaking part?
No, I think a little of both.
Yeah.
For sure, the speaking part. But, the conversations that I've had with Jimmy about this, and not recently, for the most part, he does take a back seat to the management side of things. Mm-hmm. It's Patrick Allvin on the phone, making the trade calls, the inquiries, speaking to the agents when he needs to, and all of those things. Rutherford is always going to be there as a leadership voice, a voice of reason, and a voice of experience. And I think it'd be foolish of Patrick Allvin not to bounce, some of the hockey dynamic ideas that he has, both on the immediate term, short term, and long term by Jim Rutherford. But I would say that happens in basically every market, right? Brendan Shanahan allows Kyle Dubas to do his job in Toronto, but I can't imagine there are too many decisions, small or otherwise, that Kyle Dubas makes without talking to Brendan Shanahan. Likewise, in every other market that has a president of hockey operations that extends beyond the business operations side of things. So I think the preference from Rutherford's standpoint would be absolutely let Allvin take on more of the role, both behind the scenes and when necessary in front of the microphones and to the media.
And from what you understand with these two guys too, how much rope do you think, not rope, how much power per player personnel wise do you think they'd give Rick Tocchet? They said, or Bruce said, no, they said it, that Bruce was involved in player personnel decisions in the summer. People can take that for whatever it's worth.
Yeah.
But they have a longer, deeper relationship with Rick Tocchet professionally.
Right.
Do you think he's involved, especially in these next 5 weeks leading up to the trade deadline? Does Rick Tocchet have a say now in who he likes and who should stay and who should go?
100% he would have a say. He doesn't have veto authority. I can't imagine that. But you don't bring in somebody like Rick Tocchet. And I would extend that to Bruce as well. Bruce has been around the National Hockey League for so many years. Now, the vision that Bruce Boudreau had with an individual player may not be shared by Allvin and Rutherford and the management group of the Vancouver Canucks. And then ultimately you do have an organizational decision that needs to be made. But I think it would be foolish not to consider Rick Tocchet's fresh perspective of an individual player, right? And it doesn't matter who that is. Is it an extended player like JT Miller, who's already talked about? Is it a player like Andrei Kuzmenko, who you're going into, I think it's going to be a very difficult contract negotiation or not? If Rick Tocchet in a month from now comes back and says, hey, guys, we had a horse here. I love the guy. He works as you-know-what off. We can see how productive he is. You guys have to decide what market value is for this player. I'm just telling you that he's an important part of how we move the organization forward. And given a choice, I would want him in my top 6 come training camp next year. I don't doubt for a second that Tocchet will be included in those conversations. And, maybe you extend that, because this is the one thing that I'm sure Patrick Allvin learned from Jim Rutherford in Pittsburgh. And that is, it's dangerous when you close your door to differing opinions. And it really doesn't matter where those opinions come from. Tocchet probably will speak on behalf of the coaching staff, but why would it be a bad thing to sit down if you're Patrick Allvin with Adam Foote and Sergei Gonchar, along with Rick Tocchet as you get closer to the trade deadline and say, okay, fellas, what do you think? At the end of the day, the assistants are going to concede to Tocchet because he's the head guy, but there's so much experience that I think that opinion from all of those men would be invaluable.
With regards to Bo Horvat, he apparently went to Rick Tocchet and said, no matter how long I'm here, I'm your guy. You can count on me, which, of course, speaks to the character of Horvat, but I think also speaks to the situation here that Bo knows it's not for long in Vancouver. Allvin Dregs was asked on Sunday if he had given permission to other teams to talk extension with Horvat, and he answered, even if I were to do that, that would be something between myself and the agent, suggesting very heavily that no permission has not been granted.
Yeah, it would be between the GM and the agent for 20 minutes, maybe an hour. And then we're obviously talking about it. But as of Tuesday night, Newport Sports did not have that permission to speak with clubs on the Vancouver Canucks' behalf. And I'm not being critical of this process, but we see it more and more, right? We know that Gavrikov has it. Dan Milstein is the agent there with the talented defenseman of the Columbus Blue Jackets. I don't think Claude Lemieux has it on Timo Meier yet, but you would wonder if that's beneficial to the process. And I can appreciate the Vancouver Canucks in this case of its philosophy of Patrick Allvin to try and manage as much of this as he can privately, confidentially. I appreciate that. But that's not how the world revolves anymore. It just isn't. And the Vancouver Canucks, when trading a piece like Bo Horvat, have to maximize the return. There's no swing and miss on this one, right? I mean, this guy is such an important piece of the Vancouver Canucks, both now as a leader, from an offensive perspective and the character that clearly we can see in Bo, but whatever they're going to fetch coming back the other way. The trade and sign or the side and trade is a way that you can attempt to maximize that. Like if you're a team like the Seattle Kraken, as an example, and you would have interest in Ryan O'Reilly or in Bo Horvat, right? Or even Colorado for that. It looks to me like the Colorado Avalanche definitely need a second line center. That's the way it looks to me when I assess the needs of that team creeping up to the deadline. Well, if you're Chris McFarland or you're Ron Francis, are you not sitting there going, okay, well, I don't really want to give up a blue chip prospect and a first-round draft pick or something that equates to a first-round draft pick. And I'm certainly not going to do that if I don't have an ability to extend and keep this player. Well, how can you have that conversation if you're not privy, to access to the agent? And I will say this, it's not like Pat Morris or anyone associated with Newport Sports is calling me or Pierre LeBrun or Chris Johnson or anybody and say, hey guys, by the way, we just got permission. We can speak to all teams on Bo Horvat's behalf. That's not going to happen. That's not how they're going to play it out. And they're most definitely not going to disclose confidential conversations that they would have with those other general managers. But it is a way to maximize the return.
What do you think in their own minds they think is the downside of allowing that to happen?
Probably exactly what I just said, Blake. The fear that it becomes, just a public negotiation.
Public.
Yeah. And they don't also, and you're going to ask me about some of the younger players that could be in play. Again, it depends on who you're talking to and who you're negotiating with. Ronnie Francis is as conservative as there is as NHL general managers. He's in a small handful of guys that doesn't like any of his business out there. He'll help you after the fact. If he makes a move, the decision to send Shane Wright back to the Ontario Hockey League. I mean, as soon as they posted it, I reached out and he called me within seconds of a text message. 100% on board with explaining why and how they got to that decision. Not interested in playing that out before that decision has been made.
Yeah, no, quite right, Dregs. The maximum return on Horvat supersedes anything that might be a little uncomfortable or awkward here between now and March 3rd. And I'll say this about your take on national media or local media getting upset when national media breaks stories. I don't think it's the story breaking. I think it's the access. I think we've become quite accustomed to the likes of yourself, Mr. LeBrun, Chris Johnson, Elliott, the national guys. I mean, maybe ask Dollywall on this. He's sort of the local guy who competes in that space, although I think even Rick would suggest you're kind of accustomed to national media breaking stories. It's access. It's when decision makers of your club are doing big interviews in Pittsburgh and in other markets and not necessarily tending to the home front. I think that rankles
I get that.
The local media. Blake, you had a question on some of the failure to launch guys.
Well, yeah, that was the other takeaway for the future for this club from the Sunday press conference was the talk of what they could accomplish going forward and towards the trade deadline. And it's not the first time that they've mentioned picking up players that are not too far out of the draft that are maybe just not exploding onto the scene. And that's a list that, and understand, folks, I'm not saying that any of these guys are necessarily available, but these are the kind of names that people bring up. Lafreniere, Kakko, Byfield, even Wright, we just spoke of as well. Are those realistic names that you think might be available for the right price for these marquee trade deadline acquisitions?
Well, I can't say they're not realistic, Blake, because everything has a price. And that's why I'm always loath, except for a number of players around the NHL, we deem them untouchable. You can go down every team's roster and come up with a list of players that aren't in play and would never seem to be in play in the foreseeable future unless somebody just throws a ridiculous offer their way. So let's just boil it down here a little bit. I look at the New York Rangers, and I feel like Chris Drury is itching to do something significant there.
And he's got two of those guys, right? We mentioned two of those names, so you could maybe pick the guy that you least like of the two.
Yeah, fair enough. And, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at Patrick Kane, in the Chicago Blackhawks. Well, if you're Kyle Davidson, you're in full rebuild mode. And if you're trading away your two stars in Taves and Kane, then you want to do it by balancing not just first-round draft picks and prospects, but young NHL players. So, of course, you'd be asking for Kaapo Kakko or Alexei Lafreniere. I'm hesitant, though, because the jury's still out on those kids. They're still developing NHL players. And even though they're drafted high in the first round, there's no guarantee that any player in the first round, be it first overall or sixth round, is going to pan out. But you do have to be patient in that development process. Quinton Byfield, as you say, is another name with the Los Angeles Kings. And that's another team that knows, because of Jonathan Quick, because of Anze Kopitar, the window in LA is closing. So Rob Blake has made it clear he's willing to be bold and very aggressive in adding pieces that he thinks are going to legitimately make the Kings a Stanley Cup contender. So if Quinton Byfield has to be included in that conversation, I think you have to consider it. It just seems a little lofty. And Shane Wright, by the way, so this has all been bubbling around. Again, the Seattle Kraken's, our belief, speculatively so, that they're going to be in on some of the big boys, either O'Reilly or Horvat, go down the list. And there was a Horvat for Shane Wright rumor that had been kind of percolating out there. And late last week, I checked in with somebody I trust, very closely associated, and they were assured that wasn't happening, at least then. And that seems a little high, given how new, the freshness of how celebrated, the Seattle Kraken were in getting Shane Wright fourth overall. So it feels like a stretch to me, but again, repeating myself, anything is possible.
The only problem for Chris Drury or an acquiring team is which one of Lafreniere and Kakko. The first pick in 2020, 46 games, 6 goals, 21 points. The second pick in 2019, 9 goals, 22 points. They're both playing 15 minutes and change. They almost look like identical players right now, flatly, across the traditional stats. Dregs, marvelous stuff. Thank you for this, my friend. We'll catch up next week.
All right, guys. Have a good one.